You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, conversations with the icons of our time.
And I remember saying to everybody, if it hadn't been for my child dying, we wouldn't be here doing this today. And I was really angry that it took her death before people finally woke up to the horror of drunk driving.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving founder Candy Lightner today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Until 1980, drunk drivers in the U.S. frequently faced little more than a slap on the wrist. On May 3rd, 1980, a 13-year-old girl named Carrie Lightner was walking to a church carnival when a drunk driver jumped the curb and hit and killed her. Carrie's mother, 34-year-old Candy Lightner, was appalled to learn from the police that the repeat offender who had killed her daughter was unlikely to face any serious punishment. In her anger and grief, Candy Lightner then formed a group that she dubbed Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and it quickly grew into a major grassroots campaign to force states to toughen the penalties on drunk drivers. MADD was perhaps the single biggest reason that you now have to be at least 21 to drink legally in all 50 states. But there was trouble inside the organization. In 1985, Candy Lightner was forced out for tangling with the organization's leadership over what she saw as a more bureaucratic focus than grassroots. But Candy maintained her work as a victim's advocate, and in 1990 she wrote a book about grief and death called Giving Sorrow Words. And that's when I had the chance to talk with her. So here now, from 1990, Candy Lightner.
Who is your book for?
It's for everyone. It's not only for people who are grieving, by the way. It's also for people who aren't grieving but want to know how to help the mourner or want to prepare themselves for what may come in the future, especially if they're dealing with an anticipated death situation. It's for children. We've actually had children read this book. I had a woman tell me last night that she had caught this book on another show and herself was not grieving at the time, and 3 days later her mother died and went out and bought the book, and it's been her Bible. And we also, by the way, besides discussing deaths in terms of people, we also discuss pet loss, which from my own experience I can tell you is very emotional and traumatic.
I remember my younger brother, our mother died. He was a senior in high school. It was that followed by just a year, our grandfather's death. And then the topper was when his dog died.
Oh, sure.
And he handled the first two beautifully, but the third one, he just went to pieces.
And you know why? Because we find a lot of times when that happens, they're not grieving just for the pet. They're grieving for the past losses, too, that they didn't grieve for at the time, for whatever reason. And all of a sudden this happens, and it brings all that back up.
Grieving seems to be one of those things that you're born with the ability to grieve. It comes naturally, doesn't it?
Well, you would think so, but there is so much fear, I think, placed on society in terms of death and dying and expressing pain. I mean, we see the image of Jackie Kennedy, at President Kennedy's death, remaining stoic, and how often the media commented on how positive that was and her wonderful image and how brave and strong she was. So that now people think, I really believe this, that that's the image you have to maintain in order to be admired. Well, the heck with that. When you're in pain, it's important to let that pain out.
Can you take it too far the other way, though? Do you have people coming up to relatives at funerals saying, "Hey, how come you're not crying? Go ahead, let it out." What do you just? Are there some people who go to a funeral and just? I have to confess, at my own mother's funeral, I didn't cry.
I didn't cry at Carrie's funeral until I saw the children laying the roses on her casket at the end, and that's what broke me down. And I think what happens, as you know, we talk about the myths of the different stages in grieving, how most people think there are 5 stages, you go through them one right after the other, and they each last a certain period of time, when in reality that's not true. But most people do go through some form of shock and denial in the very, very beginning. And so normally when you're at the funeral, and by the way, that's a good thing to do because it enables you to make the plans that you need to make in terms of burial and funerals and what's going to happen immediately afterwards. And so most people I found, including myself at funerals, tend to be a little bit maybe calmer or not quite as emotional or whatever. And there are a lot of people that aren't, by the way, so I don't want those people who aren't to think there's something wrong. And so people see those people that are more stoic or whatever, and they think, God, they're so brave, and isn't that wonderful? Or they think, why aren't you crying? What's wrong with you? And that's the problem, because most of us tend to react to how others think we should react to the death. And which I think is total nonsense. You need to do what is best for you, when it is best for you, and not worry about Tom, Dick, and Harry and Mother, Father, and Joe are going to think.
That's fine, though, unless you have certain very strong, well, for example, you go in toward the beginning of the book, go through with the various faiths, what they prescribe in terms of arrangements for the dead. Mm-hmm. And in certain religions, certain faiths, what they prescribe in terms of a mourning period and when it's proper to mourn and when it isn't. You can do your own thing within those guidelines, can't you?
Well, you can. I'll tell you, one of the things that I did like in terms of the Jewish religion, there were some things that I liked and disliked. One of the things I liked is they did have a prescribed mourning period, which I thought could be very helpful for some people. It was a guidance for them to use, and there was some symbolism involved, and I think symbolism is important. One of the things that I didn't like, at least in terms of one of the rabbis we interviewed, was their feelings about open casket, in which they're not enthused about them at all for religious reasons, and I happen to believe in open casket funerals. But I think outside of following whatever it is your religion dictates, and I want to comment here right after this about ministers and how religions handle death, I think you have to do what's best for you, because you're the one that has to live with yourself and function on a day-to-day basis and take care of a family, if in fact you do, or go to work or whatever. So you need to do what's best for you. But we also found, and as you know, we interviewed over 100 people for this book, and it's a sharing of their stories besides my own, that many ministers and medical personnel really do not know how to deal appropriately with death and dying. It was a common complaint of, I'd say, about 75% of our mourners.
But you also have to put yourself in their position. They have to deal with death all the time. If they get too personally involved, they'd go crackers, wouldn't they?
I don't even think it's a matter of getting personally involved. I think it's a matter of knowing what is the right thing to say. And in many cases, they're very poorly educated. They have very little training on this subject, and yet it's one of the most important things they do. They bury people. You know, they not only bring them into the world, but they also bury them too. And I mean, in my own particular case, as we all know, because it was in the movie and in the book, you know, the priest said to me, this is God's will. Well, I'm sorry, but that is not of comfort to me when my daughter has just been killed. Or, the comment that we also heard is he or she is better off with God. And as one of our mothers said, the thought that my child is better off with God than with me, makes me very angry, and that somebody would say that to me. And I'll tell you one that I didn't go into in the book that I heard quite often, and I still hear it to this day. I've had people literally call me on the radio shows or come up to me and say, I'm so glad this happened to you. And I'll look at them and they'll say, because it was destined. I know that God chose you so that you could go on and start MADD and do what you do. And I'll tell you something, that is not comforting, because I wish you would have chosen somebody else if you really believe that.
This is your first book, isn't it?
It is. It's not my last, but it's my first.
I have to confess, it's a deeply, deeply moving book. The way that you describe your own coming to terms with Carrie's death.
God, it was tough.
And I can imagine. Let's put it this way: it moved me so much just imagining how I would go through it. I have two daughters, and to even imagine, to even just begin to imagine what I would go through if I found out the way you found out about Carrie, and if I had to go through what you went through. And then when I got to the part with the flowers at the funeral, I closed the book, I walked away for a few minutes and collected myself.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
It just, there comes a point when you don't even want to think about those things, and you had to go through that. If you hadn't had the impetus to form MADD, if you hadn't had that to occupy all your time, all your attention, to put yourself before the media and, in effect, as you say, build this wall between you and your grief, would you have grieved immediately? Would you have gone through a, quote, normal process?
You know, it's a tough question to answer, and I've talked to a number of psychologists and death education counselors about this very issue. And the feeling is that in many cases when we go into what I call a long-term denial or getting stuck in a certain stage of grieving, there's a reason for that, to protect ourselves, whatever. And there was a feeling by some of them that if I hadn't done MADD, I would have found another way to avoid the pain of her death. You know, I remember when my son was run over, which I talk about in the book briefly. My son was run over by a car when he was 4, and he was in a coma, and we didn't think he would live, and he survived. But I remember at the time when he went through that thinking, my God, what would I do if he died? How would I survive? And going on about I wouldn't. I just know if a child of mine died, I wouldn't make it. And, you know, when Carrie was killed, especially in the horrible way that she was, I think that must have kicked in somehow. And my feeling was if I really sit down and cry about this and deal with this and show the pain that I'm in and feel the pain that I'm in on an ongoing basis, I'm not going to make it. You know, either I'm going to crack up or something, I'm not going to make it, because the pain is people who have lost children know, and all death, by the way, is painful, but I seem to have found, and statistics tend to bear me out, that this is the worst loss you can go through, is unbelievably incredible. And when I finally did actively grieve for her 5 years later, I found it as painful as if she had died the day before. I went through that same 5,000 pounds on my chest where I just couldn't function, where I just put aside holidays, where there were days I couldn't get up, where, as you know, she has an identical twin. And in the beginning, when there was a birthday, I couldn't even say happy birthday to Serena. And by the time I could bring myself to do it, which was maybe 3 years later, I would cry. And I finally had to sit her down and say, Serena, this is what's going to happen. I'm sorry. You know, it doesn't mean I'm not happy for you. And she was great about it. You know, she said, I understand. It's okay. And but I remember like 5 years later when I started that all over again, all of a sudden finding it difficult again to start saying happy birthday to her and celebrating her birthday. I couldn't do it. It was rough.
It doesn't, and it's no easier, as some people, again, when you talk about inappropriate comments that people make, it's no easier if it's a sudden death or if it's a slow, lingering death, if it's from leukemia or a drunk driver. A child's loss is a child's loss.
That's true. The thing we did find in terms of anticipated death, though, is that most people tended to grieve ahead of time. And so a lot of their grief was done much earlier. They went through, for example, when they were told that the child had a terminal illness such as AIDS. We have a wonderful story in there about Zachary, who had AIDS due to a blood transfusion, died when he was about 7, I believe. You know, you go through, his mother went through the denial and the, you know, when she realized it in the middle of the night that this is what was wrong with her son, you know, it was like, oh no, it can't be. So you tend to go through some of that anyway before the death, and so that afterwards, you know, there's a lessening in the intensity and the time of the grief. On the other hand, I have to tell you, some of the people we found reacted just as if it had been an unanticipated death because they simply refused to believe that that person was going to die. Whether it had been a year or 2 years, they simply could not acknowledge the fact that that was going to happen. And I went through that with my own father, who recently died of cancer and who was dying as we were finishing the book. My father didn't handle his death well, not that everybody does. He didn't want to believe that he was dying and wanted to believe that he was going to live up until the end. And I'll tell you something, it was interesting because when I was doing this book, I was going back through on the anticipated section. At the same time, I was dealing with the knowledge that my father only had several months to live. And I came across a section in the book that was talking about saying goodbye to your loved one before they die. And I went, oh, geez, maybe I should do that. And, you know, you think you know everything, and then you find out that you don't. And so I called him up. He was not very lucid. And I said to my sister, because he was in Nevada and I had just come back from there to California, and I said, let me know when he's lucid. And she did. And they called me and I talked to him. I had to talk to him over speakerphone because he couldn't hold a phone. And I went through the telling him how much I loved him. And from the book, I swear, just had it in front of me, telling him how important he was in my life and my children's life, how he would always be involved in our lives in the future, what was happening in the future. I told him about the book coming out, what the kids were doing and everything. And I remember he said to me, this isn't the conversation that I want to hear. And I said, it's the conversation that I need to say. And he says, well, I'm still fighting. And I said, good for you. We talked a while longer. He said, I love you. I said, I love you. And he died 2 days later. And I believe in a way that my conversation with him gave him permission to let go. It was saying you don't have to suffer anymore. It's okay to go. You're still a part of us. It's all right to let go. And I was so glad I did. And one other point about that, my aunt was there at the time, and she said when she saw his reaction to it, she thought, I'm not going to do this. Was going to do it. She said, I'm not going to do this. And she said the minute he died, she could have kicked herself and thought you really wished that she had gone in and done the same thing, because we realized we had to do what was best for us at the time, because we have to live with the aftermath. They're dead.
One thing I wanted to ask you, just by coincidence and by nothing else, yesterday in the mail, we got this booklet, which I don't know if you've seen. It's called America Gets Mad. It's billed as The Story of Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Am I in it?
That was my first question. First page.
Uh-huh.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving got its start in 1980 when a 13-year-old girl, the child's mother, was not only devastated. I thought, how petty. How petty that they could not even mention your name.
I'm sorry, I've had 5 years of this.
Is this how far it's
I'm
gone?
sure you realize I wasn't even invited to the 10th anniversary.
Is this how far this has gone?
Oh, it's really sad in a way. And I think, I'll tell you what's funny about it, and I used to get angry, and then I got hurt, and now I laugh, because there was a recent public opinion poll done. I don't know who did it, who commissioned it, or whatever, and 98% of the public still think that I run MADD. They still think I'm there, and I make it clear that I'm not. I mean, I'm the founder, but I'm no longer there. I left 5 years ago, and believe me, they make it clear that I'm not. And yet the public still sees me as very much a part of MADD. And I would much rather be known as the founder of MADD than other people I can think of. That's a wonderful legacy for both my daughter and I to leave someday. So, I just sort of go on with life.
Well, I was working in Providence, Rhode Island in 1980 and 81, about the time that MADD came to national fame. And I remember thinking at that time that, drunk driving's been around as long as there's been cars and alcohol, but we've never heard, and there's never been an organized effort like this. And what pride you must look back on now over the past 10 years, and out of this tragedy, of course. I mean, nobody, I would not think to tell you, well, I'm glad it happened to you, but how proud you must be of what you have been able to start, what positive thing you have been able to build out of this terrible tragedy.
I'll tell you, it's tough, because yes, there is pride, but, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'd much rather have my daughter back. I mean, I know we've saved thousands of lives, and personally I'd rather have her back. I really would. And I remember when Governor Brown called me to do the press conference with him to sign the first bills, and all the media, when we first passed our mandatory jail in California, and all the media was calling me saying, you must be so excited, you must be so happy, and I was actually angry. I was very angry that day, and I remember saying to everybody, if it hadn't been for my child dying, we wouldn't be here doing this today, and I was really angry that it took her death before people finally woke up to the horror of drunk driving. And although that anger has dissipated over the years, as it should, every once in a while, though, it still gets my dander up. In a way, especially when something like this happens, when there's a lot of hoopla at MADD, and they go on and talk about the fundraising and the money they've raised, because, I think sometimes when you become a bureaucracy, you forget why you started in the first place. You forget about the grassroots, and you forget about the parents who marched on the White House and picketed the Capitol, and who went on radio and TV with tears in their eyes and spoke at candlelight vigils about what it meant to lose a husband or a wife or a child. And that's a shame, because I think that's what had the impact on the public in the beginning, and that's what made the difference.
Candy Lightner is now 78. She runs her own company, and she is president of the nonprofit We Save Lives. Now you can get your copy of Giving Sorrow Words by Candy Lightner by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also hear my 2001 interview with another well-known activist, Aaron Brockovich.
We never thought Gee, it's going to settle for $333 million. I mean, are you kidding me? Let alone a movie be made about it. Julia Roberts is going to play me. They're going to name it after me.
And my 2006 conversation with noted anti-nuclear activist Dr. Helen Caldicott.
The nuclear power industry, they're not corrupt per se, but they're scallywags. And they have to be exposed for who they really are.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, 55 years ago this week, hundreds of thousands gathered in upstate New York for a music festival that came to be known as Woodstock. So next time, a conversation with a man who says he helped make that all possible. My 1994 interview with Elliot Tiber.
We didn't know it was an event the world was paying attention to. We couldn't see newspapers. We couldn't watch TV. We were busy in the rain and the mud trying to do what they call today is damage control. Then it was called surviving.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.